G'day, this is Chris Savage from RL Ministries in Australia, welcoming you to this session of the book of Jeremiah. I pray that it will be of benefit to you and help you in your Christian growth. Thank you for coming along. To session 26 of the book of Jeremiah, we're looking at chapter 38, verse 14, down to chapter 40, verse 6. In the last session, we see that there's an attempt to kill Jeremiah. Jeremiah gives two choices to the people, the princes and the king. He says, you can stay and fight. You can stay and fight against the Babylonians, but you're going to die. Or you can surrender to them and live. And what he did say was, Jerusalem is going to fall to the Babylonians. That's without a shadow of a doubt. Now, the princes we saw last time, the princes want Jeremiah's death because of his admonition to surrender. He's accused of demoralizing the people, the city, by speaking such words, and they also accuse Jeremiah of treason because he's saying, surrender to the Babylonians. Now, King Zedekiah at this time, as we see, he's a very weak king, and his princes are actually exercising lordship over him. They're running the show. So he hands Jeremiah into their hands for them to do with him what they will. So Jeremiah is subsequently cast into the dungeon of Malchijah, the king's son, and this dungeon was an empty water cistern where Jeremiah now sinks into the muddy bottom of this water cistern. If he stays down there, he will eventually die because he'll just fall into it and suffocate. Now, there's a man called Ebed-Melech. Now, he's an Ethiopian slave. He's a eunuch. He's a slave in the king's service, king's house. He sets out to rescue Jeremiah because he sees what these princes have done to him, and he just says, this is not right. So he approaches Zedekiah, and he says, Zedekiah, this is what the princes have done. I need to go and rescue him. So Zedekiah actually gives him 30 men to go and rescue Jeremiah out of this pit. He didn't need 30 men to lift him out, but he needs 30 men because he needs to be defended. Ebed-Melech needs to be defended against the princes who might have a go at Ebed-Melech as he is about to deliver Jeremiah from the pit. So Jeremiah was then rescued out of the dungeon. This is the cistern, and then he's placed back into where he was before, in the court of the guard, still in imprisonment, but in better circumstances. So now we're coming into Zedekiah's third inquiry of Jeremiah. This is in verses 14 to 28 of chapter 38. The inquiry itself is detailed in verses 14 to 16. In verse 14 is Zedekiah's specific request. Then Zedekiah the king sent and took Jeremiah the prophet unto him into the third entry that is in the house of Jehovah. So this time it was a face-to-face inquiry. No messengers were used, and Jeremiah was now brought into the king. And the king sent, and he brought Jeremiah to the third entry of the king's house. This is probably the same as what is called the king's entry back, where you can look at it in 2 Kings 16, verse 18. 2 Kings 16, verse 18. So here the request from Zedekiah, and the king said unto Jeremiah, I will ask you a thing. I'm going to inquire of you, Jeremiah. Hide nothing from me. However, after two previous experiences of inquiries from Zedekiah, Jeremiah was a little bit hesitant about giving an answer. And in verse 15, we have Jeremiah's objection. And Jeremiah said unto Zedekiah, if I declare it unto you, wilt thou not surely put me to death? And if I give you counsel, thou wilt not hearken unto me. So Jeremiah was concerned that if he told Zedekiah the truth that he was asking for, the king would kill him. And if he gave Zedekiah counsel, he says, you're not going to listen to me anyway. So in verse 16, so Zedekiah the king swears secretly unto Jeremiah. So Zedekiah now makes a promise. He doesn't promise to follow Jeremiah's counsel, but he does promise not to have him killed and not to give permission for him to be killed. So Zedekiah swore secretly to Jeremiah. The vow was, as Jehovah lives, that made us this soul. So Zedekiah swore in the name of the one true God of Israel. And he made the commitment. I will not put you to death, neither will I give you into the hand of these men that seek thy life. Now, at this point, Jeremiah feels free to speak. And then in verses 17 to 18, he now gives counsel to Jeremiah. So the options he provided for the people in general, he now provides for Zedekiah in particular. In verse 17, then said Jeremiah unto Zedekiah, thus says Jehovah, the God of hosts, the God of Israel, if thou wilt go forth unto the king of Babylon's princes, then thy soul shall live, and this city shall not be burned with fire, and thou shalt live and thy house. So the first option is that the king should surrender. If Zedekiah surrenders, then God promises that he would not be executed, and neither will any member of his house be executed. Also, the city will not be burned with fire. So God is very gracious and merciful here. He's giving him an option to save the city and himself and family. So first option, save himself, his family, and the city by surrendering. The second option is to refuse to surrender in verse 18. But if thou wilt not go forth to the king of Babylon's princes, then shall this city be given into the hand of the Chaldeans, and they shall burn it with fire, and thou shalt not escape out of their hand. So if Zedekiah does not surrender, then Jerusalem will fall to the Chaldeans. They will burn the city with fire. Zedekiah will not escape, but he will go into captivity, and he will remain alive, as we're going to see shortly. But many of his family members will also be executed. This is the same message Jeremiah gave previously in Jeremiah 21, verses 8 to 10, Jeremiah 21, 8 to 10, and Jeremiah 38, 1 to 3. 38, 1 to 3. Now, at this point, Zedekiah issues another objection in verse 19. Zedekiah the king said unto Jeremiah, I am afraid of the Jews that are fallen away to the Chaldeans, lest they deliver me into their hand and they mock me. So Zedekiah's character flaws become apparent once again. Now, this was a course of action that he knew was correct, but he lacked the courage to pursue it. He knew it was best for him to surrender, but he says, nah, can't do that. He was afraid of those Jews who had defected or who had gone over to the Chaldeans. Apparently, a great number of Judeans had already abandoned Jerusalem and had surrendered to the Babylonians. We're going to see this in 39, verse 9, and 52, verse 15. So many of these who deserted had deserted at Jeremiah's own advice in Jeremiah 21, verse 9, 21, 9, and 38, verse 2. So Zedekiah expresses a specific fear here. Zedekiah feared that the Babylonians would hand him over to these individuals who might abuse him. And at this point in verses 20 to 23 is Jeremiah's final admonition to Zedekiah. Now remember, Zedekiah is the last king of Judah. In verse 20, Jeremiah called Zedekiah to obedience. But Jeremiah said, they shall not deliver you. He assured Zedekiah that he would not be delivered into the hands of the Judeans who had already surrendered to Babylon. Therefore, the king had no need to fear what he described in verse 19. So now, in light of this assurance, Jeremiah pleaded with Zedekiah to obey Jehovah. And the call was, obey, I beseech you, the voice of Jehovah in that which I speak unto you. If Zedekiah would only obey, Jeremiah gives a promise for obedience. First of all, so it shall be well with you. You will not be mocked. You'll not be mocked by these Jews who have gone over to the Babylonians. Second, and your soul shall live. You'll not be executed, and neither will anyone else in your house be executed, as he had promised earlier. And in verse 21, he issues a warning. But if you refuse to go forth, meaning if Zedekiah refuses to surrender to the Chaldeans, then this is the word Jehovah has showed me. It's a word of judgment. Now, there are two parts to this judgment. Isn't it amazing? Jeremiah is giving him the option for life and for his family, but he does nothing. The first thing we see here is in verse 22. Zedekiah will be mocked. He'll not be mocked by those he fears will mock him, the Jewish soldiers who had already deserted across to the Chaldeans. Rather, behold, all the women that are left in the king of Judah's house. These are the women of the royal harem, who will be brought forth to the king of Babylon's princes. Now, to take over the royal harem, or harem, was an act of humiliation for a defeated king. If a king was defeated, sometimes he was simply made a vassal without suffering the humiliation of another king taking over his harem or his harem. I'm Jamaican, I speak funny. When a defeated king saw his harem taken over, it was a special act of humiliation. It was a supreme example of mockery. And one place we can see this very clearly in action is in 2 Samuel 16, verses 20 to 22, where Absalom, after initially forcing his father, King David, to flee Jerusalem, what did he do? He humiliates his father by entering the royal harem. The royal harem will be brought forth to the king of Babylon's princes, Jeremiah says. These princes were the high government officials and soldiers of the Babylonian forces. They will enter into Zedekiah's harem and fully humiliate and mock Zedekiah. Second thing's going to happen, these women will sing a song of mocking, taunting. It's a taunting song to Zedekiah. The words of which involve basically two lines. Your familiar friends have set upon you and prevailed against you. And they're going to say this in a tone of mockery. It's a paraphrase actually from Obadiah 7. It's an application by way of quotation from Obadiah verse 7. Now that thy feet are sunk in the mire, they are turned away back. This now is a flashback to Jeremiah's own recent experience in the dungeon of Jeremiah 38 verse 6. Jeremiah sank into the mire, and now the picture is that Zedekiah will also fall into the mire. However, Zedekiah is not going to have an Ebed Melech to help pull him out as Jeremiah did. Therefore, these women of his own harem will now sing this taunting song. Zedekiah will be mocked indeed in two ways if he does not obey the voice of God. First of all, he's going to see the Babylonian soldiers enter into his harem and take over the women. And second, the weary women of his harem will now sing this song to him. Zedekiah's fear of mockery will take place if he disobeys. It will not take place if he obeys. Only because of his own disobedience will the mockery come. Furthermore, the mockery will be worse than he anticipated. It will not come from the men of Israel, but from the women of his own harem. The punishment of Zedekiah will include two things. First, he'll be mocked, that's verse 22. Second, he will fall in verse 23. And they shall bring out all thy wives and your children to the Chaldeans, and you shall not escape out of their hand, but shall be taken by the hand of the king of Babylon, and you shall cause this city to be burned with fire. So not only Zedekiah's harem, but also his wives as well as his children would be handed over to Nebuchadnezzar's soldiers. Furthermore, Jerusalem would now be burned. Jeremiah emphasized that all of these calamities would be caused by Zedekiah's disobedience. So this now actually brings an end to the last inquiry of Jeremiah by Zedekiah. In verses 24 to 26, Zedekiah now issued a warning that his last inquiry remains secret. In verse 24, there is the injunction to secrecy. He says, then said Zedekiah unto Jeremiah, let no man know of these words, and you shall not die. So Jeremiah is not allowed to let anyone know of this conversation. And with this secret comes a promise. If Jeremiah keeps this conversation a secret, he'll not die. Zedekiah will not kill him. Also in verse 25, But if the princes hear that I have talked with you, and they come unto you and say unto you, declare unto us now what you have said unto the king. Hide it not from us, and we will not put you to death. Also, what the king said unto you. So Zedekiah said that if the princes come to him, he's to say certain things. Zedekiah feared these princes, even though he was the king. If the princes hear that Jeremiah came to the king, they might come to Jeremiah with demands of their own. And that is that he reveals the nature of his conversation with the king, hiding nothing. They might demand a full disclosure. They might also make a promise to not put Jeremiah to death if he should disclose to them what the king had said to him. If that happens, and the princes come to him, it's very difficult to keep a secret in this type of environment. In verse 26, Jeremiah must answer as follows. Then you shall say unto them, I presented my supplication before the king, that he would not cause me to return to Jonathan's house to die there. So this is what he must tell them, that he made a supplication to the king, and the supplication was that he might not be returned to the house of Jonathan to die. And again, we see Jeremiah using the word shuv, and this is true this is a true statement as far as it goes here. There was indeed no need to tell the officials the whole truth. And at one point, Jeremiah had actually presented a petition to Zedekiah regarding this not going back into Jeremiah's house. And that's in Jeremiah 37, verse 20, Jeremiah 37, 20, and Jeremiah 38, 15. However, Jeremiah was not to tell the officials what the whole conversation was about. And so there was a part in the king's proposal that was a lie. The statement is true, but he did not tell them the entire conversation. And the first part of verse 27, as Zedekiah suspected, so it came to pass. Then came all the princes unto Jeremiah and asked him. So the princes did hear the conversation, and they come to and they now make their inquiry of Jeremiah in accordance with verse 25. And Jeremiah's answer to them in the second part of verse 27 is in accordance with verse 26. And he told them according to all these words that the king had commanded. Now, 3 events took place in verses 27 to 28 as a result of Jeremiah's answer. First of all, so they left off speaking with him. That means the princes left him alone and made no further attempts on his life. Second, for the matter was not perceived, means the full story wasn't found out. And then third, in verse 28, so Jeremiah abode in the court of the guard until the day that Jerusalem was taken. So Jeremiah remained there until the day that Jerusalem finally fell. Now, from 38, verse 28 to 39, verse 10, we have the capture of Jerusalem. And this is a summary of the siege and final capture of Jerusalem. Just going to have a look at a couple of things here. Before we go further, we just need to deal with some confusing things in these verses. The capture of Jerusalem is found in 38, second part of verse 28 to 39, verse 10. But these verses could be a bit confusing here. Second part of verse 28, it says, and it came to pass when Jerusalem was taken. This is a summary statement of Jerusalem's capture. In 39, 1 to 10 are the details concerning the siege and capture of Jerusalem. So verse 28 is simply a summary statement. 39, 1 to 10 are the details. So in verse 1, we now have the date of the siege. In the 9th year of Zedekiah, king of Judah, in the 10th month, came Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, and all his army against Jerusalem and besieged it. So it began in the 10th month of the 9th year of Zedekiah. The 10th month corresponds to the month of January. The 9th year was 588 BC. So in January of 588 BC, the siege began. Nebuchadnezzar of Babylon and his army came against Jerusalem. So this date is reaffirmed in 2 Kings 25, verse 1, 2 Kings 25, 1, Jeremiah 52, 4, and Ezekiel 24, 1 to 2. The siege lasted a total of 18 months. Now, verse 2 gives the detail, or the date, sorry, it gives the date of the fall of the city. In the 11th year of Zedekiah, in the 4th month, the 9th day of the month, a breach was made in the city. So the date was the 9th day of the 4th month of the 11th year. The 4th month was a Jewish month, Av, A-V, Jewish month, Av. Therefore, the 9th of Av is a famous Jewish fast day called Tisha B'Av. The 9th of Av, a fast day over the fall of Jerusalem, is celebrated on that day. The month corresponds to July. The 11th year of Zedekiah was 586 BC, and the 9th day of July, 586 BC, a breach was made in the city. This is also mentioned in 2 Kings 25, verse 2, and Jeremiah 52, verse 5. In verse 3 are the princes of the king of Babylon. That all the princes of the king of Babylon came in and sat in the middle gate, to wit, Nergal-Sharezer, Samgar-Nebo, Sarsekim, Rabsaris, Nergal-Sharezer, Rabmag, with all the rest of the princes of the king of Babylon. So they all came and sat in the middle gate. So the fact that the princes of the forces of Babylon could sit in the middle gate shows that the city had fallen. They were in the gate itself. Now, the question arises here as to how many princes were there, because some of the names listed are a combination of personal names and titles. For example, Rabsaris and Rabmag were Babylonian military titles. Rabsaris, Rabmag, military titles. In Babylonian writings, one finds the term Rag-Mugi instead of Ragmag, and this is just an interpretation of this verse. There are two different generals by the name of Nergal-Sharezer. First general was Nergal-Sharezer the Rabsaris. Now, some scholars believe that he came from the town of Samgar-Nebo. I know this is just a bit of history. Also known as Sin Magi in Babylonian literature. The second general was Nergal-Sharezer the Rabmag. He was known in Babylonian writings by the name of Neriglissar and was the son-in-law of Nebuchadnezzar. Now, after executing his brother-in-law, evil Merodach, Neriglissar ruled Babylon from 560 to 556 BC. I knew you were just wrapped in a little bit of history there. Now, in verses 4 to 7 is the fate or final end of Zedekiah. So the prophecies of Jeremiah begin to find their fulfillment step by step. In verse 4, Zedekiah's flight. Came to pass that when Zedekiah, the king of Judah, and all the men of war saw them, then they fled and went forth out of the city by night by way of the king's garden through the gate between the two walls, and he went out toward the Arabah. So the timing was when he and his men saw the Babylonian princes in the city. They're in the city gate. They knew the war was lost, so they began to flee. Their flight is described in stages. First of all, they left the city by night. They simply don't want to be seen fleeing the city. Second, they fled by way of the king's garden. The king's garden was near the pool of Siloam, where much later on Jesus would heal a blind man. So that's where the king's garden was. This is mentioned in Nehemiah 2 verse 14, Nehemiah 2:14, 3 verse 15, 3:15, and 12 verse 37. Third, so he's now sneaking out by the king's garden. He left by the gate between the two walls. This gate was also known as the Fountain Gate. So the direction of the flight was toward the Arabah. The Arabah is a long section, also known as the Jordan Valley, where the river flows. More specifically here, it was the Jordan Valley in the area of Jericho, and he tried to cross the river to the other side of the Jordan River near Jericho. Quite possibly they crossed at the same point where Israel crossed into the land of Canaan. Now, Zedekiah was trying to leave the land in the opposite direction but in the same place to Israel when they came into the land. In verse 5, Zedekiah is now captured. But the army of the Chaldeans pursued after them and overtook Zedekiah in the plains of Jericho. And when they had taken him, they brought him up to Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, to Riblah in the land of Hamath, and he gave judgment upon him. So the army of the Chaldeans pursued Zedekiah, and the king was taken on the plains of Jericho. And he was only a mile or two away from the river when they overtook and captured him. And they took him to the town of Riblah. Nebuchadnezzar, headquartered in Riblah during this entire campaign, this is where he is, he left the fighting to the soldiers and he remained in Riblah in the land of Hamath. Now, Hamath is located in modern-day Syria. And this means that Nebuchadnezzar was 200 miles north of Jerusalem, and all of this shows that Zedekiah was taken after fleeing 25 miles from Jerusalem toward Jericho. He was then returned the 25 miles back towards Jerusalem and then taken another 200 miles to Riblah, where Nebuchadnezzar was located. And there, Nebuchadnezzar now pronounces judgment. In verse 6 to 7 is the judgment of Zedekiah. Verse 6, and the king of Babylon slew the sons of Zedekiah in Riblah before his eyes. Also the king of Babylon slew all the nobles of Judah. So all those who were connected with Zedekiah were now put to death. First his sons were killed, and then the nobles of Judah were killed. As for Zedekiah in verse 7, moreover, he put out Zedekiah's eyes and bound him in fetters to carry him to Babylon. So Jeremiah's prophecies were fulfilled to the letter. Zedekiah did not die a martyr's death. He did not die by the sword. Rather, his eyes were simply put out. The last thing Zedekiah saw was the death of his own sons. And at that point, he was blinded, bound in fetters, and then taken into captivity. And this is verses 8 to 10, we see the results in the land. And the Chaldeans burned the king's house and the houses of the people with fire, and break down the walls of Jerusalem. Then Nebuzaradan, the captain of the guard, carried away captive into Babylon the residue of the people that remain in the city, the deserters also that fell away to him, and the residue of the people that remained. But Nebuzaradan, the captain of the guard, left of the poor of the people that had nothing in the land of Judah, and gave them vineyards and fields at the same time. So what we see here is in verse 8 is a result of Jerusalem's destruction. Jeremiah's prophecies continue to be fulfilled. The king's house was burned, the people's homes were burned, walls of Jerusalem were broken down. In verse 9 is the third deportation. The person in charge of this third deportation was the captain of the Babylonian guard, a man called Nebuzaradan. The specific deportees included three groups of people. First of all, the residue of the people that remain in the city, meaning those people living in Jerusalem. This is the third and final time when the city fell. They were taken into captivity. Second, those who had previously deserted to the Babylonians, they also went into captivity. These were the ones that Zedekiah feared would mock him. They deserted earlier, but now into captivity they also go. Third, the residue of the people that remained in the land, so those living outside of Jerusalem, also went into captivity. So this doesn't mean that every single individual went into captivity, because verse 10 mentions those who were left behind. Nebuzaradan left the poorest of the people behind, who had nothing in the land of Judah. The lowest of the poor, the very poor, were left behind because they were no threat to the Babylonians. Also, he gave them vineyards and fields at the same time. These people, they did not own any fields, but now they were property owners, and they were now they were property owners because their owners were taken into captivity. So those who did not have property were given land by the Babylonians. So we see the truthfulness of a very famous saying in these verses: the mills of God grind slowly, but they grind exceedingly small. Okay, verses 11 to 14, we now see the release of Jeremiah. During the final destruction of Jerusalem, the Babylonians paid special attention to Jeremiah. Verses 11 to 12 spell out Nebuchadnezzar's own personal instructions concerning the matter. In verse 11, now Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, gave charge concerning Jeremiah to Nebuzaradan, the captain of the guard, saying, so the person responsible here for carrying out this charge is Nebuzaradan, the captain of the guard. Now, he was responsible for carrying out the deportation of the Judean people, and he was also given special orders by Nebuchadnezzar concerning Jeremiah. What these orders were spelled out in verse 12. Take him and look well to him, and do him no harm, but do unto him even as he shall say unto you. So Nebuzaradan was to take special care of Jeremiah and do whatever the prophet asked of him. Question this order raises is how Nebuchadnezzar knew about Jeremiah. There are two possible sources of knowledge here. First of all, the Babylonian king may have heard about Jeremiah through the Jewish deserters. Remember, he was the one who wanted, he would have wanted to know why these people willingly deserted Jerusalem and surrendered to him. And they would have told him that they were obeying the instructions of Jeremiah, the prophet of the God of Israel. But a second source of information may have been Daniel and his three friends who were taken into captivity in the first deportation. Now, Daniel and his friends, before being led into captivity, these four men had lived in Jerusalem during the early years of Jeremiah's ministry. So by the time of the third deportation, they had attained a position of authority within the Babylonian government and could have informed Nebuchadnezzar of Jeremiah. It doesn't matter how they found out the exact circumstances of Nebuchadnezzar's knowledge. The Babylonian king gave out special orders concerning Jeremiah's release, and Nebuzaradan fulfilled them as was his duty. In chapter 39, verses 13 to 14, we have the rescue of Jeremiah. In verse 13 are the ones that Nebuzaradan made responsible and sent to do the work of the rescue. He sent the following individuals. First of all, Nebuchadnezzar the Rabsaris, who was a high official, and second, Nergal-Sharezer, the Rab Mag. This is a second Nergal-Sharezer of verse 3, who later would become the king of Babylon, along with these two other high-ranking officers of the king of Babylon. So we have some top Babylonian officials who were appointed to release Jeremiah from prison, and this shows the importance which Nebuchadnezzar and Nebuzaradan had placed upon this action. Verse 13 lists the names of the men who were detailed by Nebuzaradan to rescue the prophet. So Nebuzaradan, the captain of the guard, sent, and Nebuchadnezzar, Rabsaris, and Nergal-Sharezer, Rab Mag, and all the chief officers of the king of Babylon. So Nebuchadnezzar, the Rabsaris, was the first person sent by Nebuzaradan. We looked at these guys back in verse 3, and we just saw that these are Rabsaris and Rag Mag. They're simply titles of government officials. Okay. The fact that these top officials were involved in Jeremiah's case shows that the importance that Nebuchadnezzar had attached to this particular action. Verse 14 describes the release itself. They sent and took Jeremiah out of the court of the guard and committed him unto Gedaliah, the son of Ahikam, the son of Shaphan, that he should carry him home. So he dwelled among the people. So Jeremiah was now brought from the court of the guard and handed over to Gedaliah. And this is Gedaliah was the son of one of Jeremiah's friends, a man called Ahikam. Ahikam, we see him in 2 Kings 22, verse 12, 2 Kings 22, verse 12, and 25, verse 22, 25, 22. Also, 2 Chronicles 34, verse 20, 2 Chronicles 34, 20, and way back there in Jeremiah 26, verse 24. So Ahikam was the son of Shaphan. He was one of the loyal servants to King Josiah. 2 Kings 22, 3 shows that. So Gedaliah was now ordered to take Jeremiah home. So this means that he was now responsible for the prophet's welfare. Now, as a result, Jeremiah remained among his people and was not taken into the exile. At the same time, the decision to commit Jeremiah to Gedaliah presented a certain danger to the prophet. Why? Because he now is in Jerusalem, and there's always the risk that Babylonian soldiers who didn't know who he was, or that Nebuchadnezzar had given special instructions for his welfare, would capture him and later on take him into captivity. And we're going to see this is exactly what's going to happen. In 39:15-18, we're going to see the prophecy concerning that man Ebed-Melech. In verse 15 is a timing of the prophecy concerning Ebed-Melech. Now the word of Jehovah came unto Jeremiah while he was shut up in the court of the guard, saying. So when it had happened, it came when Jeremiah was still shut up in the court of the guard. And these verses are out of chronological sequence, which we know is not unusual for Jeremiah, because he organized his book based upon themes and subject matter, not upon chronology. So it's a theme here. Verses 15-18 occur somewhere between Jeremiah 38:13 and 39:10. Most probably it took place sometime after 38 verse 28 and before 39 verse 11. So Jeremiah confuses us a little bit. Verses 16-18 provide the message itself. In verse 16, Ebed-Melech was told that he would become an eyewitness of the coming destruction of Jerusalem. It says, "Go and speak to Ebed-Melech the Ethiopian, saying, Thus says Jehovah of hosts, the God of Israel, Behold, I will bring my words upon this city for evil and not for good, and they shall be accomplished before you in that day." So, as an eyewitness of the destruction of Jerusalem, Ebed-Melech would see Jeremiah's prophecies fulfilled. In verses 17-18 is a promise to Ebed-Melech that he will survive with his life. The promise involves several parts. First of all, God says, "But I will deliver you in that day." So he's going to survive. Second, "Thou shalt not be given into the hand of the men of whom thou art afraid." The men whom Ebed-Melech feared might have been the Babylonians. He might be afraid that when the Babylonians finally break in and begin mass killings, he would be amongst those killed. It may also refer to the princes of Jeremiah 38:1-9. Remember, these were the princes who desired to kill Jeremiah, and now they'd be pretty cheesed off or pretty upset at Ebed-Melech for having Jeremiah rescued. Verse 18, "For I will surely save you, and thou shalt not fall by the sword, but thy life shall be for a prey unto you." So third, God promised to surely save him, and fourth, he'll not fall by the sword, and fifth, his life will be as a prey unto him, which means he will escape with his life. He will not die violently, but of old age and natural causes. Why? Well, why is this all happening to Ebed-Melech? "Because thou hast put thy trust in me, says Jehovah." So even though, remember, Ebed-Melech was a Gentile Ethiopian, he wasn't a Jew, yet he put his trust in the one true God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, the God of Jeremiah the prophet, the God of Israel. Ebed-Melech's actions recorded in Jeremiah 38:7-13, in which he rescued Jeremiah, were due to his faith in the God of Israel. He simply carried out the principle of James 2:18, and proved his faith by his works. Again, what we see here is we see a Gentile doing the same thing that Jews failed to do. And now we're into chapter 40. We're looking at Jerusalem after the fall. Jeremiah 40, verse 1-44:30. Now, the Babylonians exiled the majority of Judeans after the destruction of Jerusalem, but to ensure that the remaining population stayed submissive, Gedaliah was now appointed governor over Judah. He set up his headquarters in a place called Mizpah, which is just northwest of Jerusalem. Now, at the request of the Ammonite king, Gedaliah, his staff, and the Babylonian garrison were assassinated by a member of the royal family. And fear of retaliation now prompted a mass exodus to Egypt. Jeremiah 25, 22 to 26 mentions that. Jeremiah 25, 22 to 26. Now, these are some of the events detailed in this section. The events in Judah are recorded in chapter 40, verse 1 to chapter 43, verse 7. And the situation of the people in Egypt is from 43:8 to 44:30. That's just a brief sort of look at it. Okay, now, in Judah, what's going to happen in Judah, we see in 40 verse 1 to 43 verse 7. So this section describes Judah after the fall. And first up, we're going to see in verses 1 to 6 of chapter 40, the release of Jeremiah. And we're going to see Gedaliah's governorship in verses 7 to 12, and then his murder in verse 13, 40 verse 13 to 41 verse 3. We're going to see the description of other atrocities in 41 verses 4 to 10, and then we're going to see rescue of the remnant in 41, 11 to 18, and then we're going to see the flight to Egypt in 42, 1 to 43, 7. Okay, we're going to see the release of Jeremiah. So verse 1 gives us the occasion, the word which came to Jeremiah from Jehovah after that Nebuzaradan, the captain of the guard, had let him go from Ramah, when he had taken him bound in chains among all the captives of Jerusalem and Judah that were carried away captive unto Babylon. So Nebuzaradan released Jeremiah from Ramah. Now this seems contrary to what was described in the closing verses of chapter 39, because after the fall of Jerusalem itself, Jeremiah was released into the protection of Gedaliah. Gedaliah was a Jewish man whom Nebuchadnezzar had appointed as governor over the new Babylonian district of Judea. If we put the entire story together, it's not a contradiction. There's an explanation for it. By the time Nebuzaradan had released Jeremiah in Ramah, which is where we are now, in verse 1, and Ramah is several miles north of Jerusalem, where Nebuzaradan had found him among the captives who had been chained. Now, these were not the captives of Judah in general, but these were specifically the captives from Jerusalem and Judah. All right, so he's found Jeremiah bound in chains. These were Jews in chains who were in the process of being taken into captivity in Babylon. Ramah was 4 miles north of Jerusalem, and it served as the point of departure. In other words, the Babylonian soldiers would bring the Jews for captivity from Jerusalem and Judah and then congregate them in the town of Ramah. Ramah was the home of Samuel the prophet. It was also near the place that Jacob had buried his favorite wife, Rachel. Now, the fact that Ramah served as the point of departure for the march to Babylon is given in Jeremiah 31, verse 15. Jeremiah 31, 15. So, going back into Jerusalem, after Jeremiah was released from the dungeon prison in Jerusalem by Nebuzaradan, while he's walking down the streets of Jerusalem, the Babylonian soldiers were collecting and gathering all the captives. Jeremiah was mistakenly captured by Babylonian soldiers who did not know that he had been released. Nebuzaradan, the captain of Nebuchadnezzar's guard, recognized Jeremiah chained among the captives. And this would have been a very embarrassing experience for him. So he had Jeremiah released. In verses 2 to 4, Nebuzaradan makes an offer to Jeremiah. In verses 2 to 3, he recognized that what happened to Jerusalem was as a result of divine judgment on the part of the God of Jerusalem. In verse 2, the captain of the guard took Jeremiah and said unto him, Jehovah your God pronounced this evil upon this place. So basically, he said, Jehovah pronounced this evil or calamity upon this place. And then in verse 3, Nebuzaradan also recognized the purpose of this judgment. Remember, this guy is a Gentile. He's not a believer in Jehovah, the God of Israel. In verse 3, and Jehovah has brought it and done according as he spoke, because You have sinned against Jehovah and have not obeyed his voice. Therefore, this thing is come upon you. So Jehovah brought it about because of justice. He fulfilled what he said he would do. Israel sinned against Jehovah and failed to obey Jehovah's voice. And Nebuzaradan was not a worshiper of the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. He worshipped the Babylonian pantheon, which had many gods. Yet he did have sufficient spiritual insight to realize that the reason Jerusalem was destroyed was not because of the superiority of the Babylonian gods, such as the ones that he worshipped, but it was because of Israel's disobedience to her own God. And the result is that this thing came upon them. In verse 4, he now gave Jeremiah a choice as he was being released. He says, "Behold, I loose you this day from the chains which are upon your hand." From the one hand, Jeremiah could come to Babylon, and Nebuzaradan promised to look after him. "If it seem good unto you to come with me into Babylon, come, and I look well unto you." Jeremiah is offered personal protection by the captain of the guard himself while he's in Babylon. This protection meant that he would be well taken care of as far as his physical comfort was concerned for the rest of his life. This could have been Jeremiah's future in Babylon, being well looked after. The other option that he was given is that Jeremiah could remain in the land of Israel. So Nebuzaradan says, "But if it seem ill unto you to come with me into Babylon, forbear. Behold, all the land is before you, whither it seems good and right unto you to go, thither go." So Nebuzaradan said that all of the land was before Jeremiah. He could go to Gedaliah, who was in the town of Mizpah, which is a few miles further north than Ramah, or he could go on with Nebuzaradan to Babylon. It's interesting to note here, though, that Jeremiah gets far more respect from these Gentiles than he received from his own Jewish people. And then in verse 5 reveals Jeremiah's choice. "Now, while he was not yet gone back, go back then," said he, "to Gedaliah the son of Ahikam, the son of Shaphan, whom the king of Babylon has made governor over the cities of Judah, and dwell with him among the people, or go wheresoever it seems right unto you to go." So in verse 5, we have the choice of Jeremiah. He didn't respond vocally. The way the English reads here is, "Now, while he was not yet gone back." In Hebrew, the wording could be translated as, "Yet he would not go back." The word shuv, again being used here, S-H-U-V. So what he's saying here is that Jeremiah did not return him an answer. He did not tell Nebuzaradan, "I prefer the first choice," or "I prefer the second choice." Jeremiah was reluctant to respond, perhaps because he had a respect for the high office of Nebuzaradan. Nebuzaradan saw the reluctance on the part of Jeremiah to answer. So what did he do? He took his reluctance as a negative answer. He thought that Jeremiah did not wish to accept his offer of safe conduct and comfort in Babylon. He thought he wished to remain among his people. However, Jeremiah's reluctance was based upon the fact that it would be a negative answer, and he did not want to insult Nebuzaradan. Nebuzaradan saw that Jeremiah wished to remain among his own people, and he responded accordingly. Jeremiah was not a traitor. He chose poverty in the land of Judah rather than wealth in the land of Babylon. Now, after speaking out against the sins of Judah, after predicting judgment upon Judah, after predicting the destruction of Jerusalem, he was personally not a traitor, and he did not desire to leave his people unless he was forced to do so. In this case, he's not asked to do that. Nebuzaradan told Jeremiah to stay with Gedaliah if he so pleased, but the prophet was free to live wherever he wanted. So the captain of the guard gave him victuals and a present and let him go. So as Jeremiah departed, Nebuzaradan gave him provisions and some money for the journey back, the very things that Jeremiah's own people had refused to give him when he was imprisoned. In verse 6, it reveals that Nebuchadnezzar had appointed Gedaliah governor over the cities of Judah. Now, much had already been mentioned about Gedaliah's family. In summary, his grandfather Shaphan is mentioned in 2 Kings 22:3-13. He was a godly man. Shaphan was a godly man who raised his 3 sons to be spiritual as well. His sons were Ahikam, Gemariah, Elasa, Ahikam, and Gemariah. And they also had sons of their own as well. So Gedaliah will be mentioned frequently in the next few chapters. That's the one we're basically looking at here. Verse 6 now shows that Jeremiah joined Gedaliah in Mizpah. And then went Jeremiah on to Gedaliah, the son of Ahikam, to Mizpah, and dwelled with him among the people that were left in the land. Now, Mizpah was the northernmost city in the kingdom of Judah, and Jeremiah made a decision to stay with his people. And this brings us to the end of this session. Thank you for coming along. Study hard and grow strong.